Specifically, a large part of it, or nearly 2 hours of it, was regarding a homicide investigation where the defendant was a suspect at the time.
But the witness will not be testifying to that, correct?
No.
Okay.
No, I just wanted to.
Got it.
When you see redacted areas, and I asked that question, counsel, and I have an agreement that that's the basis. We're not trying to explain why the state's cutting things out of the interview that could be helpful to the defendant, but in reality are not.
Okay, sounds good.
That's correct. That's an accurate recitation of our agreement.
All right, let's bring in the jury. Sorry for keeping you waiting this morning. I did have a matter that ran longer than I anticipated this morning, so we were running about 10 minutes late. The parties were all here on time waiting for me. So with that, would the state like to proceed with its next witness?
Yes, the state calls Dr. Patel to the stand. Thank you.
Hello. Can you please state and spell your first and your last name?
Kumash Patel, K-U-M-A-S-H. It's up P-A-T.
Right hand. You do solemnly swear the testimony you're about to give will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God?
Yep.
Morning, sir.
Morning.
Please proceed.
Good morning, Dr. Patel. Could you please introduce yourself to the members of the jury?
I'm Kumash Patel. I'm one of the trauma surgeons.
Were you the trauma surgeon that treated James Casey back on October 8th of 2014, sir?
Yes.
Before we talk about what you did that day, let's first talk about you. Could you share with us your educational background, training, and experience?
Sure. I did my general surgery training in Detroit, Michigan, followed.
I don't mean to stop you, but two things. Could you speak up and slow down for our court reporter, Scott?
Sure. I did my trauma training in Detroit, Michigan. My general surgery training in Detroit, Michigan. Followed that, I went at Duke University Hospital. I did my trauma surgical critical care training. And then I've been practicing trauma and surgical critical care since 2006 in various different hospitals and trauma centers. What
is your current position?
I am one of the trauma surgeons at Banner Thunderbird Hospital.
Are you in a leadership position?
Yeah, I'm the trauma medical director there.
You're the trauma medical director? Is
Yes.
that a yes?
Yes.
Yes, sir. For the record. You kind of glossed over very quickly your educational background and your professional background. Would it be fair to say that your expertise is in the area of treatment of those suffering from trauma?
Yes.
Have you had a lot of experience with those who have suffered gunshot wounds?
Yes, it's one of the more prevalent injuries that we see.
Would it be fair to say that when you worked and trained, you were in essentially the emergency room center areas of different facilities in Detroit? In
Detroit, at Duke Hospital, North Carolina, as well as I was in New Orleans at Tulane Hospital and Charity Hospital. And then coming out here in Phoenix, I practiced at 6 of the 10 trauma centers in town.
And are there different levels of trauma centers that have been assigned in the medical field?
Yeah, there are 4 levels of trauma centers, 1 to 4, with level 1 being the most highest and where patients with the most injured patients come to be taken care of. And I've practiced at all the level 1 centers.
At all level 1 centers?
You know, in my career, I've only practiced at level 1 centers.
So you really are the first surgeon or medical doctor that many see after they are suffering what could be life-threatening wounds? Yes.
So when the patients arrive, I am typically in the trauma room when they arrive.
Could you tell us, for example, in this case, as you know, Officer Casey was shot in the face, correct?
Correct.
Before we talk about what you did that evening to save his life, tell us about the protocol that is in place where you work with this type of patient that comes in.
So our process is that the EMS will patch into the hospital ER with a patient describing their injuries. With that, depending on the injuries, we activate the trauma team. The trauma team consists of quite a few personnel with the trauma surgeon, me as the leader of the team. We're all waiting for the patient when they arrive into the trauma room. And when the patient arrives, we assess them, we take care of them, perform any operations or procedures that need to be done in the trauma room or up in the operating room. Followed to that, the patient is then taken care of by our trauma team, our service on the floor by various different surgeons, as well as other providers.
Where were you working on October 8th of 2014 in the early morning hours, doctor?
I was at Banner Good Samaritan, which is now Banner University Hospital.
And where was that location?
That's down on McDowell Road and 10th.
10th Street or
10th
10th
Street,
Avenue?
sorry, 10th Street.
10th Street. And shortly after 3 a.m., was the trauma team activated?
Yes,
Was that for patient James Casey?
yes.
Tell us what happened and your involvement with treating Officer James Casey.
So when he came into our trauma room, he had sustained a gunshot wound to the face, which was actively bleeding. So the first thing we did was that we got his airway protected by putting an endotracheal tube into him. And
I need for you to speak up and slow down. What did you just say, doctor?
it's about as high as my voice is going right now.
What?
So it's about as high as my voice is going right now.
Okay.
So once he came to the trauma room, he was bleeding from his gunshot wound in his mouth. We put an endotracheal tube in him and got his airway stabilized so he wouldn't swallow or aspirate any of that blood that was coming into his mouth.
What is an endotracheal tube?
It's a tube that goes into your windpipe, and it protects you from having blood or any secretions or fluid from your mouth going into your airway. Once we did that, we went ahead and tried to stabilize the hemorrhage that was occurring from the gunshot wound. First, the wound itself in the mouth was packed with material that helps form clot, and we got that somewhat controlled.
Is that commonly called gauze?
It's gauze, and there's also a special gauze called combat gauze, which is what we put both of those into his mouth to help control the bleeding.
Were you able to control the bleeding after he arrived at the facility?
We were partially able to control it at that point, enough to be able to get him to the CAT scan to kind of see what damage was done internally.
Why did you have to use a CAT scan at that point?
Because the trajectory of any kind of bullet that goes through the skin, it's unknown how far it goes and what other damage that can occur underneath the skin. And a CAT scan gives us a better idea of what damage was occurred and then what we need to do to help fix it.
What was your concern at that point?
My concern at that point was how deep that bullet went, whether it severed his spinal cord, if it entered his skull cavity, as well as how much of the back of his throat and all the bones that were injured from the bullet.
Tell us what happened next.
So after CAT scan, we had an assessment of what was going on with the injuries. He was still continuing to bleed from his mouth and the wound, and so he was taken emergently to the operating room.
Was there concern that he was continuing to bleed from his mouth?
Yes, he was actually still bleeding from his mouth. We could see it coming out through the gauze, around the gauze. It was puddling in the back of his throat. So he was still actively bleeding.
Was that a life-threatening situation?
Yeah. The amount of bleeding that he was sustaining, if it continued, he would have caused his heart to stop, and it was life-threatening.
What did you do then to address the continued bleeding after the CAT scan?
So he went emergently to the operating room where we took out the gauze and we basically explored the wound and the inside of his mouth to find out where the bleeding was coming from. And it appeared the bleeding was coming from one of the arteries in his face that gives blood supply to the top part of your mouth as well as to some other areas in the back of your skull. With that, we found the artery, excuse me. We found the artery that was bleeding and we tied it off to get control of the bleeding.
Did that then control the bleeding when you identified the artery?
That controlled the majority of the bleeding. He still had some bleeding occurring from all the tissue that was damaged by the bullet. This is kind of normal that occurs from any time. It's a raw surface bleeding that stops once his body's able to form clot.
Were you able to eventually stop the bleeding?
Yes.
And was Officer Casey been stabilized?
He was eventually stabilized after a few hours.
What had to be done to stabilize him?
He required blood products, blood products and other factors to help form clots so the oozing from the rest of the tissues would stop.
Was there a concern throughout the treatment that blood may be getting into the lung area?
Yes, with the amount of hemorrhage that was occurring and that there's a high risk that the blood that was coming into his mouth was slowly or entering his trachea and then down into his lungs. This causes quite a bit of damage to the lungs and impairs the body's ability to bring oxygen to into his system.
When fluid, I wish I walked. When fluid or blood gets into the lung area, which was a potential in this case, is there only a short-term concern or is there a long-term concern regarding what can happen to the body?
It's a long-term concern. When blood gets into your lungs, it causes basically what we think of as an internal burn, which causes the lung to not be able to get oxygen from the air and bring it into the blood supply to get to your heart. And when that happens is that you will lose oxygen to the rest of your body. And this can progress very rapidly, anywhere from a few minutes to a few hours, to a point where we're not able to get any oxygen despite being on the breathing machine into his lungs, and that can be a life-threatening event.
What is that called?
That's called pneumonitis, and which leads to then acute lung injury, and then if it continues to progress, it's acute respiratory distress syndrome.
Does that affect someone's quality of life if there's great damage?
It can, depending on how badly that damage can occur. They may be on the ventilator for the rest of their life. If we are able to get them off the ventilator, then they may not have the ability to be without supplemental oxygen or do day-to-day activities.
Even though the person may have survived in the days and the weeks following an event like this, if there was damage to the lungs, ultimately, could it be life-threatening?
Yes. The other aspect that occurs during this time, they're also at a high risk of developing pneumonias, which can also lead to sepsis and shock, and that can be life-threatening as well.
Tell us about your understanding of immediate care with trauma patients such as James Casey and the temporal aspect of it or the timing of care.
So anytime you get into an injury, the key to their patient's outcomes is how quickly can you get them to a trauma center. The quicker you get into a level 1 trauma center, the better their outcomes are. We've seen this over the last 20 years as some of our knowledge has improved. The longer you are out in the field, the less likely that your recovery is going to be.
Knowing that Ronaldo Cruz, another officer on scene, was assisting in clearing out the mouth area of Trooper Casey, would that have helped to have saved his life before the fire personnel or other first responders came?
Yes, because during that whole time, with the amount of bleeding that was occurring, he would have probably either swallowed or aspirated that into his lungs, and that could have easily basically choked him and not have the ability to breathe at that point.
Was there a concern for long-term infections related to this injury and Officer Casey?
There is. When it's an injury like this is a very high risk of getting infections of various kinds. The top one was a pneumonia. The other ones can be infections of the tissues that were damaged in his mouth and face. And then either of those two can get into the bloodstream and cause sepsis and shock.
What is sepsis?
Sepsis is infection in your bloodstream. So any bacteria that gets into your bloodstream is called sepsis. That can be very detrimental if it's not treated appropriately, and depending on the type of bacteria, it can progress to get worse, and some patients that develop that don't survive.
Your Honor, may I approach? You may. Would it help to explain your opinion in this case and what you did to have a model of a human skeleton?
Sure.
I'm going to bring up what has been marked as Exhibit 270. hold this for 1 second, Doctor?
Sure.
Thank you.
Excuse me, Your Honor.
Yes,
His mic is not facing him.
thank you, sir.
Thank you. Your Honor, may the witness stand up?
You may.
Doctor, if you could angle this a little bit so the court and counsel may also see you. Could you share with us where the wound in Trooper Casey's body was that you treated?
Okay. So his wound was right about here. You can see it right next to his nose and right below his eye.
And for the record, you're pointing to the models below the left eye?
Yep, correct.
Okay.
And the wound, and it went deep enough where it had, well, it doesn't tell him, but it went into his mouth, through his, the top part of his mouth, and then back into this area over here.
And what area are you referring to now?
This area would be right in front of his spine, spinal cord, and that's where it was.
Based upon the location of the projectile, what were you able to do to treat Trooper Casey?
So what we did was we went in through where the wound, the bullet had went through, explored that area to find what was hemorrhaging, as well as we had to go into his mouth to get the control of the bleeding. And then there was some fragments within the wound that we took out.
Were there quite a few fragments in the face?
There was a couple, I don't remember exactly how many.
Did this involve a hollow point bullet or a ball bullet?
I couldn't tell that.
If it had been a hollow point, would you have expected quite a bit more damage to Officer Casey?
Yes.
Was there concern regarding where the projectile ultimately was within the body related to the spine and the brainstem?
There is, because if it was pretty close to his spinal cord, and if it continued to go further back, that would cause more damage. So part of what we were doing on the CAT scan and when we explored it was to look how far it went in.
In the medical field and in law enforcement, is there a phrase, triangle of death?
Yeah, so the area, this is a very concerning area because anywhere around the face and this part, around the nose and orbit eyes, is a very dangerous area for any kind of projectile or bullet to go through because it's very close to the skull and brain as well as the spinal cord and the brainstem of the spinal cord. So we always worry that injuries to this area are pretty life-threatening right off the bat and can be very, either cause immediate death or cause long-term outcomes if patients survive.
Have you previously stated that this was the most fatal area for an individual to have been shot, potentially?
Yes. Yes.
And is that because of what you just shared with the jury?
Yes, just because of the area and what's behind that area.
I have no further questions at this time.
Thank you.
I have no questions for Dr. Patel.
All right, I see there's at least one juror question. Counsel, please approach. Doctor, in Arizona, the jurors ask questions through the judge.
Sure.
The first of those questions, if you know, what is a hollow point bullet?
So a hollow point bullet is a bullet that's made with an indentation at the tip of it.
Second question, was the projectile recovered or just some fragments?
All we had was some fragments.
Thank you. Any follow-up?
No, Your Honor, thank you.
No, Your Honor.
All right. Does not look like we have any additional juror questions. That does conclude your testimony. Thank you very much for coming in. You are excused.
Thank you.
the state like to call its next witness?
The state calls Jan Butcher to the stand, Your Honor.
Thank you. Detective, if you could please come forward and be sworn in by the clerk.
Also, can you please state and spell your first and your last name?
Jeanette Butcher, Jean.
Do you solemnly swear the testimony you're about to give will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God? Yes, I do. Thank you.
Counsel, please approach.
Good morning, Detective. Could you please introduce yourself to the members of the jury?
Yes, my name is Jeanette Butcher. I'm retired from the City of Phoenix Police Department from the Homicide Unit.
Before we talk about you, let me ask you this. Were you the lead investigator involving the shooting of Officer James Casey, Ronaldo Cruz, and Mike Alfano?
Yes, I was.
Is that what's called the case agent?
Yes.
Could you please share with us your training and experience?
I graduated the academy in 1996. From there, I was assigned to the Cactus Park Police Precinct. Spent 3 years in Cactus Park. I went to missing persons after becoming detective certified. Spent 6.5 years in missing persons. I transferred to the Homicide Bureau in 2005, where I spent 13.5 years investigating homicides, officer-involved shootings, and other unexplained deaths, suicides, overdoses. As far as my training as it relates to homicide investigations, I completed a 1-year on-the-job training as a detective in training in 2005. I received training through search warrant writing and also through courses such as advanced and beginning and advanced homicide investigations, forensic interviewing of children, and on-the-job training.
Have you been recognized for your expertise in the area of officer-involved shootings?
Yes, I have.
First, talking about you, do you teach nationally in the area of investigating officer-involved shootings?
Yes, I do.
For many, many years, were you the lead investigator or case agent on officer-involved shootings for the city of Phoenix?
Yes.
Did you mentor many of the detectives at the Phoenix Police Department regarding the protocol and best practices related to officer-involved shootings?
Yes, I did.
How does law enforcement or the Phoenix Police Department, when you were there, define an officer-involved shooting?
An officer-involved shooting occurs when an officer discharges his weapon and either strikes somebody, strikes an object, or simply discharges a weapon and does not strike anything. At that time, the officer-involved shooting team of detectives from the Homicide Bureau is called out to conduct the investigation. We also assist other agencies throughout the Metro Valley area in officer-involved shootings.
I want to turn your attention to the time frame of around 2006 or 2007. At that point in time, were you in the Homicide Bureau?
Yes, I was.
And did the Phoenix Police Department create a special protocol or team related to officer-involved shootings?
Yes, during that time, prior to that time, we didn't have a standardized officer-involved shooting protocol. Sometime in 2006 and 2007, the Phoenix Police Department Homicide Bureau, the Maricopa County Attorney's Office, our legal unit, along with our unions, both the officers union and the supervisor unit, got together and established the officer-involved shooting protocol, which is a standardized practice for detectives to follow to ensure consistency when investigating officer-involved shootings.
Why is it that that team was comprised of homicide detectives, if you know.
The homicide detective is considered an elite group and specializes in the utmost serious investigations and officer-involved shootings.
Are there specialists related to crime scene reconstruction or crime scene integrity issues?
Yes. Yes.
Interviewing techniques,
Correct.
ballistics,
Yes.
blood spatter?
Yes.
In fact, could you share with us what the protocol is or what is done by investigators when there is an officer-involved shooting?
As part of the officer-involved shooting team, there is many differences versus a regular homicide. In the officer-involved shootings, the team is designated as a case agent and a scene agent. The majority of the investigations I was assigned as the case agent, and that requires an officer to conduct a walkthrough, or an officer is asked to conduct a walkthrough. So initially, when an officer-involved shooting occurs, our team will respond out to the scene, will participate or attend an incident briefing. The officers, prior to our arriving on scene, are separated. So any of the involved officers are separated, and they are designated to stay with a supervisor. So there's no conversation about anything that occurred during the incident. During the walkthrough, we will separate each involved officer, complete a walkthrough independently, and those participating in the walkthrough would be the case agent, the scene agent, the county attorney, and a legal representative for the involved officer if the officer requires one. During the walkthrough, the officer will provide information as to what was occurring, as to why they shot their weapon or didn't shoot their weapon, and what their backdrop was, what was going on, what their thoughts were as to why they fired their weapon, and any other information that we ask of them. They will participate and find or answer the question as best as they can. After the walkthrough is done, which is digitally recorded, we will debrief with our command staff and other investigators.
Pulling back the lens a little bit, is the investigation often or sometimes or always an investigation into the officers who discharged their firearm?
Yes.
Is it for potential criminal liability?
Yes, it is.
A potential role as a victim in a crime?
Yes.
And is it also an investigation into those who were involved in that shooting? For example, someone who may have discharged or shot their gun at the officers?
Yes.
You mentioned that it's digitally recorded. Could you tell us, do you physically walk through the scene where the shooting occurred?
Yes, we do.
And that is audio recorded?
Yes, it is.
And are there questions asked of the shooting officer as they are conducting the walkthrough with the case agent and scene agent?
Yes, there are.
How is the integrity of the shooting scene maintained?
It's maintained through the first responding officers. Upon their arrival, they will treat any injured officers, secure the scene with their patrol vehicles, with crime scene tape, and with officer presence.
You indicated that officers who were involved in a shooting or who've been shot at are separated.
Yes.
Why is that?
To ensure the integrity of their statements, to make sure that they don't talk with one another about what they saw, what was going on, or communicate anything to one another about their involvement in the investigation.
What is a bullet count?
A bullet count is where the involved officer will provide their weapon to another detective and a crime scene specialist. Photographs will be taken, as well as of the weapon, as well as of the officer's uniform, to depict what the officer looked like as to whether or not he or she was readily identifiable as law enforcement. During the bullet count, not only is the weapon photographed, but also any and all magazines that the officer has on his or her person, and the magazines are then emptied out, so an accurate account can be made of how many cartridges or how many bullets the officer fired.
As part of that, if there was body camera footage, would that also be reviewed?
Yes, it would.
This occurred back in 2014. Was there body camera footage that night? No. Was there a dash cam that was recording the incident that night?
No.
Was the protocol that you just shared with the jury, was that followed in this case involving Ramon Bueno?
Yes, it was.
We talked about you being a case agent. What are the roles and responsibilities of a case agent on an investigation like this?
Case agent would conduct the walkthroughs with the involved officers, conduct witness interviews, suspect interviews, talk with other officers, or excuse me, other detectives who are conducting search warrants, conducting the scene investigation, interviewing other witnesses, to be advised of everything that is currently ongoing in the investigation. They would also talk with next of kin or family and friends of suspects, if known.
What is the role of a scene detective?
Scene agent is responsible for the scene investigation. In this case, it was Detective Toby Myers, and she would be responsible for the scene at the Night's End, directing and the crime scene specialists and assisting them in collection of evidence, measuring evidence, identifying bullet strikes.
What is the role of a crime scene specialist?
Crime scene specialist will support the scene detective. They will take photographs, collect items of evidence, impound items of evidence. At the scene, they will also measure items of evidence and create a diagram.
How did you first become involved in the case involving Ramon Bueno?
I was contacted at home by Sergeant Barrett and asked to respond to the Night's Inn at 1624 North Black Canyon.
And was that on the early morning hours of October 8th of 2014?
Yes, it was.
Do you remember that night now?
Yes, I do.
Do you remember the weather conditions of that night?
Somewhat cool and rainy or drizzly.
When you responded to the Night's Inn, tell us what you did and what happened.
I-17 was blocked off. I was able to park north of the Night's Inn, I think at the Jaguars, just north and west of that location, and ultimately attended an incident briefing once all detectives arrived.
To help explain your testimony, did you prepare a demonstrative timeline of events?
Yes, I did.
I'm going to put Exhibit 273 up on the Alamo. Would it be fair to say that this was an extensive investigation?
Yes, it was.
Does this timeline include all of the interviews that were done in this case?
No, ma'am, it
Does
doesn't.
it include all of the search warrants that were conducted in this case?
No, it doesn't.
Is this the highlights or major points of the investigation that were captured?
Correct.
So tell us what a briefing is and what happened at 6:15 on October 8th.
A briefing is a starting point for our investigation. We, the Homicide Bureau, along with professional standards, were provided information from Sergeant Hood, who was a night detective sergeant, about the information known up to that point. we would obtain information relating to the involved officers, relating to a suspect vehicle, occupants in the vehicle, and a brief synopsis of what had occurred according to, again, what had been known up to that point.
So essentially, was Sergeant Hood part of the leadership team of patrol that first responded to the Night's Inn?
He was night detective, yes.
And at that point, what happens in terms of the gathering of the information and moving forward?
After the briefing, Sergeant Adam Barrett provided the assignments.
Who was assigned to what role?
I was assigned as the case agent. Detective Mraz was assigned to assist. Detective Toby Myers was the scene agent. Detective Bishel was assigned to assist the scene. And then other detectives were assigned support tasks.
Tell us about your interaction with Officer Alfano.
I participated in a walkthrough, I conducted the walkthrough with Officer Alfano. He was shaken up during the walkthrough, but was able to answer some of the questions I had asked him relating to the shooting. He advised me that he was at a different location, received a car-to-car request from Officer Casey to respond to his location because he was on a traffic stop with several occupants in a vehicle.
Did he answer all your questions as best he could?
As best he could, yes.
Did he refuse to answer any questions?
No, he did not.
Did he complete the walkthrough with you and others involved with the walkthrough?
Yes, he did.
And it appears here that you then did the walkthrough with Ronaldo Cruz, correct?
Yes.
Was he cooperative?
Yes, he was.
What was his demeanor throughout the walkthrough?
He was very composed, a little bit stressed, but very composed, was able to articulate very well the events as he recalled them participating in the walkthrough.
Did he answer all of your questions?
Yes, ma'am, he did.
Now, you've been involved in approximately how many officer-involved shooting investigations?
Approximately at least 40 where I've been case agent.
And you teach in this area, correct?
Yes, I do.
And you're recognized in this area?
Yes, I do. Or yes,
Is
I am.
it common for those who are involved in a shooting to have a different perception of, for example, how many shots were fired?
Absolutely.
How can you explain that based upon your expertise, training and experience, and review of research in this area?
Under high-stress situations, people will recall events differently. Some will experience tunnel vision. Sometimes events will either slow down or speed up during the incident. And many times in participating in a walkthrough, officers involved will not be able to accurately recall how many shots were fired from their weapon, and that can be confirmed with doing the bullet count after the walkthrough is completed. Many times an officer will either underestimate or overestimate the number of shots fired.
In this case, there may be a witness who may say, who's facing up with the thing that I remember so vividly? Can you explain why that may be that person's experience and not another individual's experience based upon your interviews?
Depending on sometimes life experiences, sometimes attention to detail or lighting, different angles, witnesses will recall things differently. And that's not surprising. If everybody had the same story or recalled everything the same, I would be concerned or surprised.
So is vantage point important?
Yes, ma'am.
Life experience important?
Yes, it is.
In this case, are you aware of the fact that Ronaldo Cruz had extensive experience in combat training in the military?
Yes, ma'am.
Are you aware of the fact that he had extensive training related to emergency combat medical rendering?
Yes.
Treatment, I should say.
Yes.
What did you do after conducting the walkthrough with Troopers Cruz and Alfano?
After we debriefed and provided the information we had learned to command staff and other investigative personnel, I went to the Phoenix Police Department headquarters.
Was it important to start the investigation in looking at what was left at the scene where the shooting occurred?
Yes, ma'am, it was.
At that point, did investigators have information regarding the car?
Yes.
Was there a license plate that was known?
Yes, there was.
What about the two driver's licenses that were left on scene? Was that important for you as a starting point?
Yes, very much so.
How many agencies were involved in this investigation from the time of the shooting, approximately, to after the capture of Ramon Bueno?
At least 4.
Were there federal authorities involved?
Yes, there were.
Were there multiple local agencies involved?
Yes.
Was the Marshals Task Force involved?
Yes, ma'am.
And in fact, was there a command post that was set up at the Phoenix Police Department for approximately the week until Mr. Bueno was caught?
Yes, it occupied the Homicide Bureau conference room.
Were there helicopters that were searching the area nearly immediately following the shooting, looking for the blue Sable?
Yes, ma'am.
That evening, did you and other investigators seek out video surveillance footage from the local railroad area?
Yes, we did.
Why was that?
The railroad had actually contacted a Phoenix Police Department and had observed 2 people walking through video surveillance across the train tracks. Investigators went over to that location and reviewed the video and then turned it over to investigators.
And was that video impounded?
Yes, it
Was that surveillance footage?
was. Yes.
Now at noon that day, less than 9 hours after the shooting, was the Sable found?
Yes, it was.
Where was that located?
Down somewhere on the south side, 2908 West Pima Road.
I'm going to show you what's been marked as Exhibit 272. This appeared to be an accurate map of the area and locations that were found during this investigation.
Yes.
The state moves Exhibit 272 into evidence.
No objection.
Excuse me, 272 is admitted and may be published.
Thank you, Your Honor. I'm putting Exhibit 272 up on the screen. Now, if we're looking at 1624 North Black Canyon Highway, and where the vehicle was recovered at 2908 West Pima Street, estimating, about how far away is that, Detective?
Probably less than 3 miles, thereabouts.
Were there officers that were canvassing the area of the Knight's Inn?
Yes, ma'am.
And did you direct, and other investigators direct, officers to canvass the Knight's Inn door by door, every motel room?
Yes.
Were there many eyewitnesses to this scene?
Yes.
Was from the Knight's Inn, was William Sunderland one of the only people to see anything?
Yes.
And I asked an artful question, were you also including officers Cruz and Alfano as being an eyewitness to this?
Yes, I was.
Now, when officers and investigators were processing the blue Sable, at that point, was Laurie Richardson a person of interest?
Yes, she was.
And Vanessa Martinez, was she a person of interest?
Yes, ma'am.
And Valyria Jaime, was she a person of interest?
Yes, she was.
And were officers actively looking for those 3 women?
Yes.
Was there a known relationship based upon interviews between Valyria Jaime and Ramon Bueno?
Yes, there was.
What was that relationship, Detective?
Boyfriend, girlfriend.
And as this investigation developed, was there extensive media coverage?
Yes.
And are you aware that Ramon Bueno and Danny Vargas were 2 individuals that were featured for a full week extensively in the media?
Yes.
Were there billboards up around the Phoenix metro area with their images on them?
Yes, there were.
The next day, on October 9th, was the interview of Valyria Jaime important?
Yes.
And what time was she interviewed?
Approximately 5:30 p.m.
And tell us about the circumstances surrounding how Laurie Richardson came into contact with law enforcement.
She was outside of a restaurant and officers contacted her and transported her down to the station.
Did she call in and tell investigators where she was?
Yes, she did.
So she turned herself in willingly?
Yes.
Was Valyria Jaime cooperative?
No, she wasn't cooperative.
Now, you did 2 different interviews of Laurie Richardson, right?
Yes, I did.
Was she completely forthright in her first interview on October 9th of 2014?
No, she wasn't.
Did she minimize?
Yes, she did.
And did she indicate whether she was scared or not during that interview?
Yes, she did indicate she was very scared.
Now, as these interviews are being conducted, were there many members of Danny Vargas' family and Ramon Bueno's family that were being contacted?
Yes.
Do you know the name of Ramon Bueno's sister?
Yes.
And what is that? What is her name?
Ida Fernandez.
I'm sorry?
Ida Fernandez?
And is it Ida Bueno Fernandez?
Yes, it is.
Who was she dating at that time?
Luis Perez?
Now, on October 9th, was there an interview conducted of a man by the name of Johnny Ray Garcia?
Yes.
And did that interview lead to following up on surveillance footage near his home?
Yes.
And where was that at?
The surveillance footage?
Yes.
It was in the area of 29th Avenue and Buckeye.
Would that have been at the Cold Air Cafe?
Yes, ma'am.
Could you tell us what the Cold Air Cafe is at that area of 29th and Buckeye?
It is an internet cafe, computers, different internet services are provided. You come in and use the computers after paying a small fee. And there's also an air conditioning service as well there.
Is that a 24-hour business?
Yes.
And was there surveillance footage that was followed up on and captured?
Yes, ma'am.
And did Kendra Griffey, one of the crime scene specialists, impound that evidence?
Yes.
Did you review that surveillance footage?
Yes, I did.
What did that surveillance footage indicate to you as the lead detective in this case?
Indicated that Ramon Bueno had been at the cafe shortly after the shooting, within minutes or half hour.
And that cafe was located at 2905 West Buckeye Road?
Yes, it was.
Would this later prove to be helpful in the interview of Ramon Bueno?
Yes, ma'am.
While we're on the topic, do you see Ramon Bueno in the courtroom today, Detective?
Yes, I do.
Could you please describe where that person is and what that person is wearing?
He's at the defense table wearing glasses, a blue shirt, long sleeve, and a blue tie.
Your Honor, may the record reflect the identification of the defendant.
So reflected.
Were you able to not only capture the video surveillance of the defendant, but also how he got there?
Yes, ma'am.
Was that important to the corroboration of other interviews that were being conducted by people in that area at that time?
Yes.
Now, on October 9th of 2014, James Casey was not able to speak, correct?
That's correct.
I'm going to show you what's been admitted as Exhibit 123. As described by investigators, would this have been the condition that James Casey was in on October 9th of 2014?
Yes.
Because of that, was it possible to conduct an interview where he could speak to investigators?
No, ma'am, it was not.
Instead, did Detective Mraz contact Officer Casey and show him a series of photographic lineups?
Yes, he did.
And did Officer Casey write something on a notepad?
Yes.
The next morning, actually, I'm sorry, the next afternoon, were you able to conduct an interview of James Casey and ask him about what happened during the shooting?
Yes, I did.
And at that point, could he speak to you?
Yes, ma'am.
And was that recorded?
Yes, it was.
Was he able to describe for you what the rear driver's side passenger looked like?
Yes.
The middle passenger, what that person looked like?
Yes.
The rear passenger side passenger, what he looked like?
Yes.
The driver's physical description?
Yes.
And the front passenger's physical description?
Yes, ma'am.
Where did that interview occur, Detective?
In the hospital room at Good Samaritan Hospital.
Later that day, was there an interview of another woman involved in this investigation?
Yes.
Who was that?
Vanessa Martinez? Excuse me. No, Adriana Ramirez.
And was that interview at the Phoenix Police Department?
Yes.
And why was that interview important to the investigation?
Ms. Ramirez was the aunt to Danny Vargas, so we spoke to her about the whereabouts of Danny Vargas.
And was she able to provide information regarding her interaction with Danny Vargas on the evening of October 8th, the next day, after the shooting?
Yes.
And was this important information to follow up on regarding the tracking of Bueno and Vargas?
Yes, ma'am.
Would it be fair to say that within 24 hours, Bueno and Vargas were the main suspects as being the two outstanding people from the car?
Yes.
And would it be fair to say that Ramon Bueno was identified as the main suspect, the shooter, based upon the investigation?
Yes, ma'am.
Now I'm going to turn your attention to October 11th. Why was the interview of Luis Perez important?
He was living with Ida Bueno Fernandez and possibly had information and had talked with Ramon Bueno.
Was this interview recorded?
Yes, it was.
And were all of these interviews conducted at the Phoenix Police Department in the conference room with audio and video recording?
Interview rooms, yes.
On October 13th, at that point, Vanessa Ramirez was contacted, is that right?
Vanessa Martinez?
Martinez, yes. And in fairness, there were multiple police reports where she was referred to as Vanessa Martinez and Vanessa Ramirez.
Yes, ma'am.
And And was that important to the investigation, setting forward the sequence of events that occurred on October 8th of 2014?
Yes,
Now, on October 14th, Ida Bueno Fernandez was interviewed, right?
correct.
And she actually came back the next day and provided extensive information, correct?
Yes,
Was that important to establish telephone numbers?
yes, it was.
Were you able to gather information regarding the telephone number that the defendant was using after the shooting?
Yes, ma'am.
Were you able to identify different areas where he was hiding after the shooting?
Yes,
And the next day, she was interviewed again, correct?
correct.
And at that point, she had an attorney with her?
No, I don't believe she did.
At some point, did she have Jay Beckson, a defense attorney, assigned to her during the interview process?
Yes.
What happened on October 15th?
That was ultimately the day when Ramon Bueno and Danny Vargas were arrested.
Now, was it important to the investigation that this case involved the defendant and his gang ties?
Yes,
Was that helpful in looking at different information that was being provided?
yes,
Potential witness intimidation issues?
correct.
Were you running into many witnesses who knew the defendant but would not share information because of his gang ties?
Yes, ma'am.
Did that make sense to you as an investigator who'd been involved in criminal street gang investigations?
Yes,
Was it important to the investigation that Detective Clint Davis was involved?
very much so, yes.
Tell us why his involvement in the investigation was important in understanding the witnesses and ultimately evidence that was found with Louis Perez.
Detective Davis is an expert in gang and the gang culture. So by having him available to assist, he was able to provide a lot of information as to how the gang culture works and just how intimidating they can be as to why witnesses would not come forward or provide information to investigators.
In this case, was there a sheet of paper that was taken from Louis Perez's wallet, hidden within a Social Security card that had a telephone coded within it?
Yes.
And ultimately, as part of your investigation, were you able to look at that telephone number and find corroboration related to Ida Bueno?
Yes, I did.
Tell us about that connection.
In one of the interviews with Ida Bueno, I had asked her if she would be willing to review her telephone calls. She said that she
Objection,
would.
hearsay.
Sustained. The response will be struck from the record.
Did you look at phone records on Ida Bueno's computer that had the same telephone number that was in Louis Perez's wallet?
Yes,
And were you able to see that same telephone number in the phone records that was also in the coded piece of paper from Louis Perez's wallet?
yes, ma'am.
Based upon that information, was that helpful in identifying for investigators the location of Ramon Bueno on October 15, 2014?
It was helpful in identifying the telephone number, yes, for Ramon Bueno.
Also talking about October 15th, was that the day that officers contacted or were able to find the defendant, Danny Vargas?
Yes,
Were they together?
yes, they were.
Where were they together at?
They were together at 4251 West Vista Lane in Phoenix.
Was it important to the investigation that there was also an individual who was associated with both the Kofeld Jets and the Mexican Mafia that was in the house that they were hiding out in?
Yes,
Did that make sense based upon your conversation with Detective Clint Davis?
yes, it did.
Were individuals that were also found in that house with those three men, those three gang members, were they interviewed?
Yes, they were.
Were they law enforcement friendly?
No,
Were they cooperative?
I don't believe they were, no.
Now, on that day, then, You were able to interview the defendant?
Yes, I was.
Did you read him his Miranda rights?
Yes, I did.
Did you record the interview?
Yes.
Did he agree to speak to you?
Yes.
Did he complain about his physical condition?
Yes, he did.
What was he saying?
He said that his head had hurt and his shoulder had hurt.
In response to that, did you seek help for him?
Yes, I did.
Did you ensure that he was not in such physical pain that he couldn't talk to you?
Yes.
What did you do to ensure that he felt comfortable enough or was cleared to speak to you medically?
I requested the Phoenix Fire Department respond. They examined the defendant, and then he was subsequently transported by officers to the hospital and then returned back to the Phoenix Police Department headquarters, where I resumed the interview.
So was he at the Phoenix Police Department headquarters when you talked to him?
Yes.
Was that entire interaction recorded?
Yes.
Even with the fire department coming in and talking to him, was that recorded?
Yes, it was.
And then you said he went to the hospital to be checked out?
Yes.
Less than 2.5 hours later, had they cleared him and he'd been transported back to the Phoenix Police Department?
Yes, ma'am.
Was the only thing identified was an old shoulder injury that he had?
Yes.
And did you continue to talk to him at that point?
Yes, I did.
Was he in the interview room for approximately 5.5 hours? Plus,
Yeah.
I should say this. Was he in the interview room prior to being transported for approximately 25 minutes?
Yes.
And that's when he was taken to the hospital to be checked out?
Correct.
And then was he in the interview room for approximately a little over 5.5 hours?
Yes.
During that period of time, would it be fair to say that there were times when investigators had left the room and so he was allowed to sleep?
Yes.
Or he was waiting?
Yes.
Did you give him food and water?
Yes.
And in fact, did you ask him if he needed anything throughout the interview process?
Yes, I did.
Did you threaten him at any point?
No.
And did he agree to talk to investigators regarding this investigation?
Yes, he did.
Now, there are some things that were simply not relevant to your investigation, right?
Correct.
And so have those things that were not relevant to what happened with Officer Casey, were those redacted?
Yes.
Along with the times where he was sleeping or times when he was simply waiting?
Yes.
And we'll talk more about that, well, we'll play that interview today. Following that interview, Ramon Bueno, did you interview Danny Vargas?
Yes, I did.
And was he cooperative?
Yes.
Did he read his Miranda rights?
Yes.
And he answered questions?
Yes, he did.
And did he share information regarding what happened on October 8th of 2014?
Yes, he did.
Were you able to follow up on that information?
Yes.
Now, on October 20th, did you follow up with Laurie Richardson?
Yes, I did.
What did you do?
I conducted a follow-up interview with her.
Now, at that point, did you have a whole lot more information based upon having interviewed now everybody that was in the car on the night of October 8th, 2014?
Yes, I did.
Did you have physical evidence?
Yes, ma'am.
Did you now have surveillance footage from different locations that she said she had gone to?
Yes.
Did that include AZ Core Brokers, the place where she and Vanessa and Valyria went to after the shooting?
Yes.
Did you have the 4 cartridge casings and the t-shirt with Danny Vargas's blood that was found at the railroad tracks?
Yes.
And did you have items that had been impounded as part of the investigation during the execution of search warrants?
Yes.
And had there been a cell phone, been reviews of different cell phones that had been used?
Correct.
Now, cell phone information was not as useful in this case, is that right?
Correct.
And this was back in 2014?
Yes.
However, was there an effort made to get as much information as possible from cell phones?
Yes, there was.
Was it important to the investigation regarding the laptop that had been left in the car in the blue Sable?
Yes.
Why was that laptop important to the investigation regarding who shot Officer Casey and then shot at Officer Casey, Cruz, and Alfano a second time?
The laptop was located in the driver rear seat on the floorboard. So the person in possession of the laptop would be the one doing the shooting, and that was ultimately Ramon Bueno.
Was it important to the investigation for you as the case agent to look at the condition of the blue Sable?
Yes.
Was there something about that condition that was helpful to you regarding who shot at Officers Cruz, Casey, and Alfano?
Yes.
And what was that?
The shots came from the driver rear side passenger, again, where Ramon Bueno was sitting.
And was there something about the roof that was helpful to investigators to corroborate what eyewitnesses indicated?
Yes, there was a strike along the headliner or roof liner of the vehicle on the driver's side rear.
And would a Phoenix Police Department ballistics expert be best positioned to explain to the jury the directionality of projectiles
Absolutely.
and the significance of burn marks?
Yes, ma'am.
So you're really good at some things, but some things you leave to others. Is that fair?
Yes.
And would you leave the ballistics and firearms expertise to vet out?
Yes, I would.
Your Honor, I think now would be a good time if possible.
All right. We are going to take our lunch break at this time. Please remember the admonition applies, and we will see you back here at 1:30. Thank you.
All rise for the jury.
Please be seated. Detective, you may leave the witness stand. Is there anything we need to address before lunch?
Your Honor.
Here at 1:30.